Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History Vibe Podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Andrew Mark Henry. And for those that do not know about Andrew Henry was a graduate of history from Messiah College, now Messiah University, and attended a bachelor program in the classical languages of University of Pennsylvania. In 2012, he began studying for a PhD in religious studies at Boston University, specializing in early Christianity. While at BU, he was a teaching assistant for Stephen Profero, a professor of religion and popular author, and studied abroad in Jerusalem as a research fellow at the Albright Institute for Archaeological Research, and he completed his PhD program in August 2020. He is the host of the YouTube channel called Religion for Breakfast. The channel is tagged in the description below, so go over there and subscribe if you haven't already done so. And that being said, thank you for joining me today, Dr. Andrew Henry.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me. So, I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on Jesus the magician. And before I get to the main questions I want to ask, could you tell the audience about who Morton Smith was?
Yeah, Morton Smith looms large in the study of the New Testament. He was a biblical scholar of the New Testament, and I believe it was the late 70s, 1979, somewhere around there. He published a book called Jesus the Magician that made a lot of waves at the time. It was kind of a iconoclastic book or heterodox book, if you will. He basically made the argument that Jesus was a magician, and that the miracle stories that we read in the Gospels are reminiscent, or they parallel magical practice that we see elsewhere in the ancient Mediterranean. And he went a step further and said that the earliest layers of the Jesus tradition were much more, shall we say, magical, and that later editors, maybe even the gospel writers themselves, kind of softened this image of Jesus the magician and cloaking it more in a persona of miracle working instead of magic. So that was Morton Smith's argument. It's a very problematic book. I would, as a scholar of magic, I would say he's wrong most of the time. But something I appreciate about the book is that he kind of teases apart this category of miracle versus magic. I think a lot of us have an opinion of what counts as miracle, what counts as magic, and he plays with these categories, challenges his audience, if you will. Can we think of miracles as magic?
So when you look at the Gospel of Mark, do you see what Morton saw in Mark? Does Mark's Gospel portray Jesus as a magician?
So short answer is no. I mean, this is going to take some teasing apart. He has this elaborate argument of like layers of the gospel that has been obscured, that was obscured in later iterations of the gospels, and this doesn't hold water, except for the exception of the so-called spit miracle. I believe there's two in the Gospel of Mark, maybe just one, but there's a miracle in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus, spits and I believe puts spit on the eyes of a blind man and heals him of his sight. And it only half works. Jesus asks the man, "Can you see?" And he says, "Well, I can see, but it's like I can't quite see." And then Jesus tries again, and then the man can see. So there are a few texts from roughly the same time period. I believe Pliny the Elder mentions spit being medicinal, and forget the other text. I think it has something to do with Vespasian, where some story about Vespasian healing a man with,
I think that's Suetonius, where he talked about spitting the spittle.
Yeah. So that would be a little bit later than Jesus. But there's at least some sort of tradition that, at least in the Greco-Roman world, there's some belief in the efficacy of spit for healing properties. And then when you read the same story in the Gospel of Matthew, the spit is removed, or the entire story is removed. I mean, so Mark Goodacre has the argument that the gospel writer of Matthew may have been either scandalized or somewhat embarrassed by this story, and then removes it entirely. So that's the only point where you could say, oh, there might have been an earlier layer that we see in Mark that was removed in Matthew, that you can give Morton Smith any credence there. But where Morton goes too far is he compares almost in like there's this term of parallelomania, where you're just constantly trying to find parallels between two different things to prove that this thing is like another thing. And so Morton Smith will take the story of the baptism of Jesus, and the dove comes down, John the Baptist is there, and Morton is like, oh well, this is just like a magical formula that's mentioned in the Greek magical papyri. See, there's a bird that comes down and there's water, but when you go and you read the ritual in the Greek magical papyri, there's really no comparison. And the formula is from a text from 3rd or 4th century Egypt, so hundreds of years after Jesus, has nothing to do with 1st century Jewish practice. So he's doing a very classic historical mistake of like trying to compare two different things that are not remotely comparable. So that's where he goes too far. I think his text, his book is, you can appreciate what he does with the categories of miracle versus magic. You can at least say, okay, the spit miracle in Mark might have some credence there, but I mean, what does magician mean? I mean, I would ask you, how would you define magician?
Someone that I guess I would normally, I guess what's is normally defined as someone practicing magic tricks when they do something, make other people think they're doing something that's not really happening.
Yeah, I mean, so when we say magician, there's several things that come to mind. We can think of a stage performer, a Chris Angel sort of figure who's performing feats on stage or sleight of hand. We can also think of a folkloric or fantastical figure like Gandalf or Harry Potter. So even here in English, we don't really know what we mean by magician because it means so many things. And so when we say Jesus was a magician, we have to immediately critique this term magician. What do we mean? Because in antiquity, what would that word mean? So frequently the word that we translate as magician is the Greek word magos, which so famously appears in the Gospel of Matthew when the 3 magi from the east come and visit Jesus. They follow the star. So that's the same word, magos. We don't say 3 magician. We either say wise men, or we translate, or we don't translate it and just say magi. So this term itself, magos, derives from Persian. It referred to a Persian priest who would perform any number of priestly activities, sacrifices, divination. And then over the centuries, it was adopted into the Greek language. And sometimes ancient Greek authors like Herodotus and Xenophon tried to use the word magos ethnographically. They'd be like, oh, there's these priests over in Persia. They're called magi. They perform sacrifices. They perform divination. But very early on, by the 5th century even, in the 4th century BC, magos starts to take on a more spooky valence to it. So in Sophocles, King Oedipus, Oedipus yells at Tiresias, the seer, and calls him a magos and a charlatan and a beggar. So like even by Sophocles' time, this word is a pejorative. It's a term that you use to call somebody a spooky weirdo doing weird stuff. Nighttime rituals, talking with the dead, what we would call ambivalent or illegitimate ritual. Any ritual that I find problematic, that's what magi do. And so this other term is associated with magos, which is magia, which is just the art or practices of the magi. That's what magia is. And we usually translate that as magic. But magia, going along with this negative terminology of magos, usually quickly became a term referring to rituals that I find problematic and spooky and weird. And so it's a term of accusation or a term of othering. So when we translate, when we say Jesus was a magician, are we claiming people back then would have viewed him as a magos? And in some respects, he was, at least by Celsus, the Greek philosopher writing in the late 2nd century. Um, I don't want to keep lecturing. Do you have any follow-up questions before I dive into Celsus?
Oh no, I was going to ask you about Celsus anyway, so continue, please.
Yeah. So Celsus, we know about him because of the early Christian theologian Origen, who wrote a book called Against Celsus, Contra Celsus. And the actual work that Celsus wrote, apparently Celsus wrote some sort of polemic smackdown against Christianity, and his original text is lost, but Origen extensively quoted Celsus, paragraphs at a time. So we have a sense of what Celsus was writing. And at least in a few instances, he refers to Jesus as performing magia and goetia, which is another ancient Greek term, which can be translated as sorcery, but again is a term for spooky, illegitimate ritual of the sort that I think that what you're doing is weird. So I'm going to call it goetia. So he accuses Jesus of when he went to Egypt, as described in the Gospel of Matthew, he must have learned some sort of magical arts, and then he came back and started doing that stuff in the Galilee. So Celsus kind of invents this backstory of, and the Egyptians and the Greek imagination were these wonder workers, experts of esoteric knowledge, and he kind of applies that stereotype to Jesus. And then Origen comes along and it's like, oh no, Jesus, he's not doing magia, he's doing miracles empowered by the Lord. So he even in antiquity, we're seeing the breakdown of these categories. So I would say magic versus miracle are subjective categories. They're not anthropological categories where you can come up with a list of criteria that would differentiate between one act as magic and the other act as miracle. Because as soon as I've heard it all. I've heard people say, "Oh well, miracle doesn't require paraphernalia. It doesn't require, materiality like an amulet or a talisman or a wand. It doesn't require extensive formulas. It's just, power. Jesus says, peace be still, and the storm stops. That's a miracle. That's not magic. But if he flourished a wand and said abracadabra, peace be still, then that's magic. And I think that's arbitrary. That's a subjective distinction for several reasons. First of all, Jesus does use materiality. We were just talking about the spit miracle, spit and mud. It appears in the Gospel of John too, I believe.
Yeah.
And we also have plenty of examples of so-called magicians doing so-called magic with no paraphernalia and very short commands. There's an early Christian text, I believe it's called the Acts of Peter and Paul, where Peter and Paul face off against, I believe it's Simon Magus, and Simon Magus is just like doing miracles. Well, he's doing what we might call magic. Like he has like dogs come forth, like these angelic demonic dogs he controls, and he doesn't really use paraphernalia. He doesn't use long strings of vowels or weird words like abracadabra. Like he just kind of works power in ways that are just kind of understated. So as soon as someone starts trying to define magic by criteria like length of the invocation or materials that are used, it quickly becomes arbitrary. So I would argue that a miracle and magic, these two categories are moral, value-laden categories that people inject their own values into. If it's a ritual that I find ambivalent and illegitimate or weird, I'm going to call it magic. And if I think it is divine or sanctioned or not weird, I'm going to call it miracle. And really, that just comes down to our own subjective opinions about what counts as illegitimate. So if I were to attempt the most anthropologically neutral way I could describe what Jesus or Harry Potter or the Jedi, what they do, I would just call it thaumaturgy, which is just the word for wonder working. So a thaumaturgical performance, it could be something like raising someone from the dead, lifting an X-wing with your mind, shooting energy beams out of a wand. These are all works of wonder, and some of them require paraphernalia, like Harry Potter's wand. Some require very little paraphernalia, like when Yoda lifts the X-wing in The Empire Strikes Back. He's doing very little except raising his hand, which is something Jesus does. He touches people, he touches eyes, so he does very subtle gestures. Would we call what the Jedi do magic or miracle? Well, they don't really use invocations, they don't really use wands, so we would call it miracle, right? No, like that would be an arbitrary distinction. We could call a thaumaturgical perspective, thaumaturgical performance. And if we really don't like what they're doing, we would call it magic. And if we thought it was great and we love it, we call it a miracle. So this is just a really long-winded way to say Jesus, we can't call him a magician because it's not an anthropological term. It's not a term that an anthropologist or an archaeologist or a scholar of religion should use. It's a folkloric literary term. So we could use a term like sorcerer or witch to describe someone like Medea in ancient Greek, mythology. But that's not an actual social category. She's a literary figure. And then we have somebody like an ancient Roman amulet maker or curse tablet maker. There's all these objects that we call magical, like curse tablets and amulets and incantation bowls. But these aren't being made by figures like Medea. They're being made by a guy who knows how to make a bronze amulet, or an expert who knows how to carve a gem, a magic gem. These are like craftsmen. So the word magician, it's a literary term, so it can't be applied to a figure performing, on-stage exorcisms. And it's at the same time also not a term that we can apply to the people doing what we would call magic, like amulets. So it's kind of this nothing subjective term.
How does Matthew and Luke smooth down Mark's portrayal of the magician Jesus?
I mean, I forget the exact details. It's been a while since I read it. Doesn't Matthew remove the story completely?
I think it at least removes bits of it. Yeah, like one of the things that ignores from Mark, and Luke also ignores from Mark, is the spittle on the eye.
Yeah.
At Bethsaida, that's not in either of them.
Yeah. So the spit is removed entirely. So that's what Mark Goodacre thinks is the evidence of the embarrassment. There's another story that scholars think is historical and might point to Jesus having been accused of magic, or magia rather, so let's use the native terms instead of the English translations, is the whole accusation that Jesus casts out demons by the power of Beelzebul instead of the power of God. It's the Beelzebul accusation, as it were. And Giovanni Bazzana, I think he still teaches at Harvard. He wrote a book on exorcism, and he argues that this must be a historical kernel that can point to the historical Jesus, that he may have been actually accused of casting out demons through evil power. Kind of based on the whole, the embarrassment of including that story. Why include that if it did not actually happen? So that goes back to what I was saying about these acts of thaumaturgy are ambivalent. So if a guy is walking around and he's famous for casting out demons, you as the audience have to decide, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And presumably some people in the audience of Jesus said, oh, that this is a bad thing, therefore he's casting out through the power of Satan. And people who liked him were like, oh, well, he's casting out, and by the power of God, this is a good thing. But it's the same practice. It's casting out evil spirits, and it's how you morally categorize that behavior, that practice, that performance. on whether or not we call it magia or miracle. And this is exactly what Celsus was doing too. Celsus and Origen were reading the same gospel stories, but they came to two different conclusions. One guy called it Goetia, the other guy called it, wonderful miracles. So the practice itself is ambivalent. What do we make of this? He's doing all sorts of these wild thaumaturgical things. Like how do we interpret this? And some people interpret it with presumably derision or fear or some motivation to call it evil, to put it into the bad category, the magia category. And there's a whole range of native terms that we could just loosely translate as sorcery, but they all have their different valences. So goetia, magia. There's the term pharmakia, where we get the word pharmacy, which originally referred to more substance-based practices like herbs or potions, but eventually became kind of a catch-all word that would be roughly synonymous to magia, so illegitimate ritual. But these are all terms of accusation. So no one would say, "Oh, I'm doing magia. I'm a magos and I'm doing magia." It was a term of accusation. It was sometimes used anthropologically or ethnographically. So that the gospel writer in Matthew, I don't know if he was thinking of magos as a illegitimate ritual practitioner when he used that term. So he probably was thinking, Eastern priestly figures. But by and large, it was a term of accusation.
Was Morton Smith's controversial secret mark involved in any way in his argument about Jesus being a magician?
I just don't know that. I don't know anything about. I know the controversy of secret mark, but I have not looked into whether it overlaps Jesus the magician.
And so when you look at the reconstruction of the historical Jesus, do you think there is some truth to him being a magician in some kind of way, or not really?
Well, again, I wouldn't say magician, and I wouldn't say magos, but I would say it's extremely plausible he was some sort of ritual specialist. So let's go back to something I was saying. So there's a whole range of ritual practices that the ancient Greeks and Romans and ancient Jews did that we kind of colloquially call magic. So using amulets, chanting an incantation to get a demon out of you, creating a curse tablet. So the Greeks and Romans would take pieces of lead and they would write a curse on the piece of lead and roll it up. They curse so and so for stealing my cloak. May his guts explode or something. Some of these texts are pretty grim. They would roll them up and they would either chuck them into a well or into a grave. There's temples around the ancient Greek world, ancient Roman Empire, that you could deposit these cursed tablets. So there's a temple to Demeter outside of Corinth, where we found a bunch of cursed tablets. And then there's these incantation bowls from Mesopotamia, where you would write like an incantation against Lilith or demons in general. Frequently, they've been found buried upside down in houses, and so there's a theory that they're kind of like ancient demon traps. You try to trap a demon under a incantation bowl, like you would catch a cockroach. So these are a bunch of ritual practices that people actually did. Did a magician make these? Well, the incantation bowls frequently make allusions to the Talmud. Who's a literate expert in ancient Mesopotamia that would know Talmudic teachings? Well, rabbis. So there's a really strong argument that these incantation bowls were being made, at least the incantation, by rabbis. We have amulets from late Roman Egypt that have liturgical phrases from the Christian liturgy, like the Trisagion, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God." Amulets with the Lord's Prayer on them, or amulets with the letter of King Abgar of Edessa to Jesus that they would fold up and like put into their necklace or into their pocket. Who in late Roman Egypt was literate and knew liturgical phrases and was able to write these out for people that are concerned about sickness or demons? Well, monks, bishops, priests, so Christian clergy. And if you walk into a temple of Demeter and walk up to an altar and find a bunch of curse tablets buried around that altar, who is literate enough to make those tablets for you and also will enable you to walk on into the temple? Well, the priestesses of Demeter. So all this to say, these are not secret, spooky, ambivalent, evil, illegitimate rituals. These are just normal, everyday things that people were doing back then, being facilitated by normal, everyday people like rabbis, priests, monks, and the priests of Demeter. So this is what I mean by magician is not a legitimate or real anthropological social category in antiquity. Who were the practitioners doing magic back then? We would use terms like scribe, priest, rabbi, and in some cases we see evidence of workshops being used. So like in magic gems, we have these beautiful ancient Roman magical gems, intricately carved with like an image of the anguipede, the snake-footed one, who's like this, I guess you could say, Gnostic being that's chicken head, man body, snake for feet. So we have these intricately carved magical gems that require specialized gem workers. So we can imagine an ancient ritual marketplace where you're like, oh, I have a headache and I really need to deal with this headache. So I'm going to go to the local gem worker and have him make a gem for me. Or I really want to curse my neighbor. He really pissed me off. He stole some business from me. So I'm going to go curse him, but I need to go to the lead guy first and then bring the lead to the priestess of Demeter, who will then help me write out the incantation and then help me bury it next to this altar. So we can think of this very above ground, not secretive, magical marketplace. And never once is the job title magician. The job title is gem worker, lead worker, priestess of Demeter. Like, these are the social categories. So all this to say, we might use a very broad term like ritual specialist, a specialist in curse tablet making, a specialist in amulet making, a specialist in incantation bowl making. And so when I see stories about Jesus exorcising demons, we can think of a job title like exorcist, something like that. So we can use this broad term ritual specialist. So you asked me, do I think Jesus was a magician? I say no. Do I think Jesus was a freelance ritual specialist going around positioning himself as a person who knows the ritual techniques to expel demons from your body? It seems pretty plausible. It surely would not have been odd in the first century Galilee for a guy walking around positioning himself as a ritual expert with the expertise to expel evil spirits from your body. And we know this because we have a few roughly contemporaneous bits of evidence of exorcistic practice. So the Dead Sea Scrolls have a few exorcistic formulas. 11Q11 has a few exorcistic formulas. I think it's 4Q560 is another one. It's very fragmentary, but it seems to be talking about the expulsion of demons from your body. And then Josephus has a curious story in his Antiquities where he mentions a Jewish exorcist in the court of Vespasian, I believe using a ring of Solomon to like get a demon out of a person. So at least within one generation of Jesus, Josephus was able to, was aware of a story. We don't know if his name was Eleazar, if this exorcist Eleazar is actually historical, but like Josephus actually knew of a story of a Jewish exorcist in the late first century. So all this to say, very plausible. It just depends on how much of the Gospels we want to take as historical, but it's certainly well within plausibility that Jesus positioned himself as an exorcist. But I wouldn't call that a magician any more than I would call the guy making the amulets or the curse tablets a magician. I would call them a scribe or a rabbi or a priestess of Demeter. Like those were their job titles, not magician.
So, in other words, if someone asked you, "Is Jesus an exorcist?" you would be more comfortable saying
Mhm.
yes to that.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's a more anthropological term. I think we could more defensively uh, define what an exorcist is. You know, someone who positions themselves as having command over evil spirits, um, or spirits in general, versus this more folkloric, mythological category of magician, which we could arguably apply to some ancient literary figures like Medea or Circe in the Odyssey when she turns Odysseus's crew into pigs. Like these are the folkloric characters that we have the term sorcerer or witch to apply to them. Um, but again, you know, those figures are not, you know, social categories, not an actual person who went out there and wrote a formula onto a clay bowl in Mesopotamia. Yeah.
When you look at the story, and obviously the Beelzebul scenario is the Beelzebul pericope is an example of people getting upset at Jesus having the power to apparently do exorcism. Um, but are there other stories like it in Mark where they're upset, or Pharisees and other Jews call out Jesus because they don't like him doing this?
Yeah, there are. And I mean, I personally find it curious. I you would think it's a good thing if this guy, if you believe this guy was casting out evil spirits, you know, you would think that would be a good thing. So I don't know why the accusation for him casting them out by Beelzebul, why they would reach for some sort of negative explanation for the practice. But I think it goes back to the crowd reactions or the Pharisee reactions to being somehow concerned or scandalized or even scared of his wonder working, his thaumaturgy. I think goes back to the ambivalence of these practices, or like the ambiguous power, like how is this happening, and what could happen if this man was angry, or like what sort of power could he command? Um, that's why I've been using the word ambiguous so much, because so many of these practices are ambiguous and sometimes scary, like, you know, having control over the weather and walking on water. Uh, you know, the disciples were terrified when they first saw him on the water too. So there's like this sense of I don't, you could even say ominous, um, and that's why I think the audience, a reader like Celsus, can look at this and clock these practices as nefarious. Even though the gospel writers set Jesus up as a positive figure, I think it's understandable that a reader like Celsus can read these things and go and interpret them as negative because of the ambiguous power. So much of these moral categories is trying to like place these uh, practices on your moral scale. Like, do I like this or do I not like this? And this comes up a lot with some practices like curse tablets. Like curse tablets are sometimes referred to in Roman law as negatively, like you should not do this. Like these are evil practices, but they were still offered at local temples. So, but there's much less concern about rituals like amulets, where they are not quite as aggressive or negative. So ancient Romans and Greeks were doing the same thing, like trying to morally uh, categorize these practices.
So for my last question, what would you say is the most what would you say is the most difficult thing about this kind of research on the historical Jesus?
I mean, the obvious thing would be just the nature of our sources. Like, you know, the Gospels are famously not uncomplicated eyewitness accounts. So you know, just the phrase historical Jesus, we're kind of pushed into a speculative corner Even Giovanni Bazzano, when he thinks the Beelzebul accusation is historical, he admits like we just don't know, but it sounds like something that would have been an actual accusation that would have been hurled against a person positioning themselves as a freelance ritual expert. So that's the nature of that. That's a pretty obvious one. And then the lack of comparative material. I mentioned Josephus and like a handful of Dead Sea Scrolls, but even those practices are very different from the exorcisms that we read about in the Gospels. Like the Dead Sea Scrolls exorcisms are longer formulas, and Jesus usually just says, come out, very short. So the gospel writers don't seem to be drawing on that exorcistic tradition that was apparent in first century Judea. The Josephus account is later, possibly not historical as well, and also uses paraphernalia like a ring. So there's like we had to kind of grasp a little bit at straws. I feel a little more comfortable comparing the exorcisms of Jesus to exorcisms from Qumran. Like we are at least dealing with the relatively similar region, relatively similar time frame compared to what Morton Smith was doing, trying to compare late Roman Egyptian magic to first century Galilean exorcism. Like he was, I think, really breaking the comparative religion methodology there. But just the lack of comparative material. And then the final challenge that I hope I was able to challenge the audience on is our own preconceptions about these categories. Like what do you think miracles are? How would you define miracle, and how would you define magic? Do you really think you can come up with a watertight, defensible definition that would distinguish between two different practices, one that would be miracle and one that would be magic? And I think once we are self-reflective about the categories that we use, we can then embark on much more rigorous, methodologically sound, theoretically sound historical analysis. And this is something that religious studies is so great at as a field. Like we are constantly self-critiquing our categories. What is religion? What is ritual? What is magic? What is miracle? And that I do think helps build a stronger foundation for historical study.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Andrew Henry.
Thank you for having me.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.